Welcome to the show. This is the first episode in a multi-part series on the roots, causes, and hopefully resolutions and purifications of the Catholic priest abuse crisis. In this first episode, we're going to do a deep dive into the data, summarizing both John Jay reports, a Los Angeles Times summary, and the data given to us by the USCCB. Now, if you hear the word sociology and your eyes glaze over, don't worry. We're going to break it down to where I need it at the 6th grade level. Don't miss this first episode with Father Paul Sullins on The Patrick Coffin Show. Happy to welcome Father Paul Sullins to the show. He's a senior research associate at our good friends at the Ruth Institute and is a former professor of sociology at the Catholic University of America in Washington. Father Sullins is also a leader in the field of research on same-sex parenting and its implications for child development. He's written 4 books and scores of scholarly articles. Father Sullins, welcome to the show.
Happy to be with you this afternoon, Patrick.
And thanks for your priesthood. You're one of the few exceptions to the rule of celibacy in the Latin rite of the Church. You're a married man with kids.
Right. Absolutely. It's a great pleasure and joy to be accepted into the Catholic Church. I'm a convert. I think you're a convert too. And we found our way to the home, to the source of our faith. And so I'm very, very pleased to be here.
I always like to talk to the wives of Catholic priests and get their feelings on celibacy.
Right. I should say I wrote a whole book on this topic. It's called Keeping the Vow, The Untold Story of Married Catholic Priests, Oxford University Press 2015. And I interviewed almost all the married priests in the United States. And I did something that in that book that no one else ever did before, which is I interviewed almost all the wives. And so I have a chapter on just that topic, on how the wives feel about their journey to the Catholic Church and clergy celibacy and all of that. One of the interesting discoveries was that married priests like myself are more in favor of celibacy for Catholic priests than celibate Catholic priests are. And their wives are even more so than the priests in favor of the rule of celibacy. About 60% of married priests favor the rule of celibacy compared to only about 40% of celibate Catholic priests nationwide. And 90% of their wives are against married priests in the Catholic Church, and they would know best.
Sure. I mean, they have the on-the-ground angle on what St. Paul says about being divided, right? This could be a whole other topic, but in any way, thanks for your priesthood and for your work here with the Ruth Institute. How did you get connected with, first of all, the Ruth Institute, and what drew you to your distillation of, it's a set of data about what priests have been doing, badly behaving, in some cases criminal, since about 1950, but there are several different ways to interpret the data, and even the people who created the John Jay College report seem to be denying what's hiding in plain sight. So how did you get involved with the Ruth Institute, and what drew you to do the study that you did?
Well, 3 or 4 years ago, I retired from Catholic University to devote myself to full-time research on issues in the public square that would advance the Church's teaching and positions. Most of those issues have to do with sexuality, sexual morality, the sexual revolution. So I've done research a lot on abortion and on same-sex couples and same-sex parenting and on the natural family and other related issues. And so that happens to be what the Ruth Institute is all about, too, about healing the victims of the sexual revolution and also trying to change the culture, to move the culture in a positive way back toward the valuing faith and family. And so it was a natural fit. We kind of just started talking, and I started and came on board, you might say, and came into the team at the Ruth Institute. I do the boring sociology that, as you talk about. I'm sort of the introverted scholar that sits in the room and writes things, and then the Ruth Institute are all these wonderful, engaging people that help to make that accessible to people and to bring that to people that it can really help.
Well, the eye cannot say to the ear, I don't need you, right?
Right. Absolutely.
When I think back to my undergrad days and the names Emil Durkheim and Talcott Parsons flash through my mind, I go into a deep coma. That's right. Sociology majors will find that funny. Everybody else will already be drifting off. Before we do a dive into the numbers and how you've summarized the problem from the 50s until today, could you say that the victims of priestly sexual abuse are also the victims themselves, and the priests in a certain way are also victims of the failed sexual revolution?
Yes, absolutely. The idea that sex is for recreation, that to have sexual experience and activity is part of the good life, human fulfillment, has become widespread in our culture. And at the time that Catholic priests were engaged in widespread misconduct, actually it wasn't that widespread, but a lot more widespread than now, let's say. It was also our culture in general was engaged in an opening to more and more sexual misconduct. The 1980s was the height of homosexual men and activity in Catholic seminaries, and also the height of the abuse of minors, mostly males. But that was also the time when homosexuality was coming out of the closet, generally speaking, in society. We had the rise of the HIV crisis and lots of unacceptable behavior all across our society that really further pulled apart the family. And Catholic priests, you might say, got caught up in that. Now, that's a point that was made in the John Jay reports, and I agree with it. There was general rise of deviance in society in the 80s across the board, and it has declined since. It's declined in the church since. So very much so, it related to and a victim of the sexual revolution. Remember, the sexual revolution came into the Catholic Church through the issue of contraception, mostly. It was the reaction, the rejection of Humanae Vitae that really began to open up Catholics to the idea that they didn't have to necessarily follow church teaching on contraception, and then on premarital sex, and then on divorce, and it just one thing kind of led to another.
Yeah, the 70s and 80s certainly were the debut, the ball debut of homosexuality, especially the 80s. The 80s were a very gay decade in pop culture and music. You've got Boy George, you've got all the big-haired, glossy-lipped male singers. And then in the 70s, you had the TV show Soap with Billy Crystal, first openly gay character.
Right.
Then you have David Bowie, and then all the gender-bending things seem to happen in the 70s and 80s. It's so part of the new normal now, but that's really the genesis of it, and you can see how that rise of normalization of that lifestyle corresponds with the number of victims, right? So they rise and fall together.
They do, yeah.
Go ahead.
So sex abuse in society, child sex abuse, in the scholarly literature we just say CSA. And CSA rose in society and peaked in the late 80s and the early 1990s and has declined by about 75% since then through society generally, as our whole culture has become more aware of the great harm that it does to children and of the danger, the prevalent danger that children can be in when adults with bad intentions or maybe just weaknesses, have access to them privately. And so, we had the rise in the 90s of restrictive laws, of mandatory reporting laws, of an awareness of safe spaces, the teaching of stranger danger in schools, and all of those things have helped to bring down sex abuse generally in society and also in the Catholic Church.
This is one point you make, that clergy sexual abuse, I guess another form of CSA, right? Is still a problem, but it peaked as we record this about 35 years ago, and it's declined a lot more than most people think. If all you do is read the New York Times, you're going to assume that every second Catholic priest is a pervert predator. Right. But let me kick the tires a little bit. Here's a devil's advocate question. We keep reading that victims tend to stay silent for decades and only disclose if they're children in their 30s. Why wouldn't the same thing apply today? Are we not looking at this through Pollyanna wishful thinking glasses that in fact 30 years from now we'll look back at 2019 as one of the worst? Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, I do. I address this very point in the study. If you talk to Catholic pundits and commentators, I won't name names, but many of them will tell you that we don't have any clergy sex abuse problem in the Catholic Church today. And that's because if you look at the John Jay data and then you look at the more recent Pennsylvania grand jury data, very few of the allegations are of abuse that has happened currently or has happened since, let's say, 2000. And they say, well, see, there's only, 2 or 3% of the allegations are of abuse that's happened at the present time. But I make in the paper the very point that you've alluded to, and that is that most of the allegations are backward-looking. In fact, the average allegation in the John Jay report, it has a lag time of 28 years. So that means that if someone reports abuse today, it's most likely to be abuse that happened in the 1980s.
Yeah.
The only way we're going to know by that measure how much abuse we have today is if we could time travel 28 years into the future and see how much abuse people are reporting then about what happened to them today. Well, we can't do that. And so what I do in the report is I only look at reports of abuse that happened within the last year, and for some of the analyses within the last 2 years. And so I'm looking at reports of current abuse, someone who is saying to a bishop or to a police official, I'm being abused right now, or my child was abused in the last 6 months. And so I look only at those allegations and trace their rise and fall over time. And that gives me a much more reliable indicator of the trend. So there is a rise and there is a fall, but it's not nearly as great as it would look if you're looking only at retrospective allegations. But it's also not nearly as high as it was back at the height of the abuse crisis in the 1980s.
Okay, I heard that. This is back to my own confusion with the practice of sociology, because one of the other key points you make is since 2002, abuse has been rising amid signs of complacency by church leaders, and today is comparable to the early 70s. That sounds on the face of it like a contradiction, like it's getting better, but it's not getting better.
Well, it did get better. Right after the charter in 2002, there is virtually...
It's the Dallas Charter, right?
The Dallas Charter for the protection of children and youth. It mandated Catholic dioceses to implement strict procedures for the protection of children. All clergy and all volunteers, anyone who had access to children had to get fingerprinted and certified not to be on an offender registry list. There was mandatory training in safety for both for adults and for children. Lots of policies. For instance, in the Catholic Church, if you work with children, you can't ever be alone with that child. You have to have at least 2 people present in order to prevent some of the opportunities that might come up for someone to be abusive. So after the implementation of all of that, abuse went way down in the Catholic Church and stayed down for about 5 years or so. But since then, it has been creeping up, and it has risen. And so abuse in the last decade is a bit higher. It's about 20-30% higher than it was in the decade of the 2000 or the aughts, right? So it is coming back up. You can find this out for yourself just by going to the USCCB website and reading the audit reports, which I did. They're sitting there. The church pays for an independent company to audit the compliance with the charter and the rate of abuse in all Catholic dioceses every year. And those reports are on the website. And if you look at the reports for the last 2 or 3 years, there's a section called complacency. And there is an introductory letter from the chair of the committee that oversees abuse, not oversees abuse, oversees the response to abuse, that points out that some of these things that these policies are not being enforced as vigorously as they once were. And that some dioceses are beginning to slip on reporting all of the incidents of abuse or on training everyone on abuse, retraining people. The charter has been in place now for more than 15 years, and some dioceses fingerprinted and trained and certified people initially, but haven't done it again. Now, some dioceses have implemented retraining after a certain period of time, but about a third of dioceses, they haven't done any retraining. So if you came on board past that time, or if you passed the screening 15 years ago, you haven't had to do it again. So they're pointing out to us that there's some laxity and slipping, and it's showing in the data as we have some rising rates of abuse today.
Well, there's laxity in following up and keeping in line with the principles of the Charter. But there's another element here that many lay Catholics, myself included, find galling about the Dallas Charter. And that is that the bishops exempted themselves from the conditions that they wanted to impose on everybody else, when in fact, so much of the abuse is tied to episcopal malfeasance. A priest was reported, he had a credible allegation, and he was just moved to a different parish or sent to some lame institute of recovery. And now I've heard the bishops explain that in canon law, one bishop can't out another. There's no authority in the hierarchy of the church, and that's fine. But the fact that bishops only report to the Pope seems really lame as a reason to not publicly shame or call to attention of or encourage or something in a sideways way. Like, why? That's the part that doesn't compute with a lot of people. Because I'm a professional speaker. I go to conferences, and I have to get the full background check. It's like, a digital colonoscopy background check. And I wonder if bishops who travel, who may have done terrible things or let terrible things happen, they don't have to go through the same scrutiny. That's what galls the average lay Catholic.
Yeah, I think that when people talk about clericalism, that would be at the top of the list for that. And bishops who complain about clericalism, I would love to ask them the question, have you mandated these procedures recently for all the people in your diocese?
And for yourself, self-imposed.
Yeah, exactly, right. So it's kind of like the U.S. Congress, that passes a lot of laws and then exempt themselves from being subject to those same laws. It is I think a natural, common tendency for oligarchies or for groups that are in charge to, think they're a little better or exempt somehow from the rest of us.
It's good to be king.
And it is galling. But, in fairness, it's galling to many of the bishops, too. And they were kept from doing anything about it at their last bishops' meeting because the Holy Father wanted to defer to his meeting that's coming up later this month. And it is only the Holy Father who can discipline and take strong action against the bishop that's done the kind of misbehavior and enabling of abuse that is so galling to many of us. So on this issue, I think that we have to hold out for and hope and ask God for wisdom and mercy on the part of the Holy Father so that he can do his job. He can strengthen the brethren. He can convict and convince the unconvinced to follow the faith.
Well, the only but I would insert here is that the 2/3 of the bishops voted against the proposal to encourage the Holy See to release the documentation that's extant on Uncle Ted, former Cardinal McCarrick. I can almost hear the sound of it. What's the phrase? The shredding machine. I don't know. I'm not even sure how many records are left. That's in the galling department. That's another thing that's galling. I understand the Pope put the kibosh on them acting, but 2/3 did an anonymous vote to even lift a finger to get to the bottom of McCarrick. Not a good sign for this upcoming meeting in Rome, in my humble opinion.
It's not a good sign, and we have signs that among our older bishops, there probably are those who themselves are homosexual and who are more positively inclined toward welcoming homosexual priests than it would seem to make sense to many of us laity.
Well, this is a great segue to one of the more
I should say us laity.
Yeah, sure. Well, y'all laity works too.
That was a slip, yeah.
This is one of the fascinating parts of your of the study, which, by the way, after all this, I should say that the title is Catholic Clergy Abuse Related to Homosexual Priests. You took the time to compare the proportion of homosexuals in the priesthood, let's say in the 1950s, and when it was more or less tracking the population of homosexuals in the general population, compared to the population or the proportion, the share of homosexual priests in the 80s.
Right.
And there's a compensatory rise in that number to, I want to get the number right, 8 times the general population in the 80s,
right,
which is also strongly correlated with child sex abuse. Now, what you've done with this number crunching effort that I so appreciate is that you believe, based on this, that 12,000 plus minors, mostly boys, would not have been abused in those years had the homosexual population been at 1950s level. Am I correctly summarizing it?
Yeah, that's right. Now, that's an estimate, but it's an estimate based on strong statistical models. And basically what I did is to interrogate one of the claims of the John Jay report. Now, the charter process authorized the John Jay College of Criminal Justice to write 2 reports on the wave of clergy sex abuse in the Catholic Church. The first report was in 2004, I believe, and the second one was in 2011.
Yes.
And the one in 2011 was on the causes, probable causes of the abuse, and it very lightly kind of skimmed over the probable cause of homosexual priests. The argument that it made was that the rise of homosexual priests that had been reported occurred later than the height of the abuse. The abuse, they claimed, was at its peak in the 1970s, and homosexual priests did not start to come in to the church in large numbers until the 1980s. They were basing that claim on the media reports of widespread homosexual activity in Catholic seminaries that many of us are aware of. And as you were saying, the 1980s was a gay decade when there were lots of out-of-the-closet activities. But what they did not do, and they admit they didn't do it, was to look at any actual data on the proportion of homosexual priests at any point in time. And so I filled in that gap. And I used a survey that was done by the Los Angeles Times, a very large survey of Catholic priests. It was done in 2002. The LA Times has a very good polling department. They had surveyed Catholic priests before. They did an almost similar survey a decade earlier, 1993. And using that survey, I was able to estimate the proportion of Catholic priests at any point in time, going back the last 40 or 50 years, that were homosexual, and also the proportion that were ordained in any given year that were homosexual. They surveyed the priests, and they asked each priest about their sexual orientation using a standard scale. We call it the Kinsey scale. And the priest reported the range of their attraction from exclusively heterosexual to leaning heterosexual to over to exclusively homosexual. They also asked the priests when they were ordained. So using those 2 data points, I could tell what was the percent of priests that reported being homosexual or having homosexual attractions that were ordained in any given year. And then from that, I was able to compute or estimate the percent that were in the priesthood as a total in any given year. Now, it's true, we had a huge spike in homosexual priests ordained in the 1980s. From 1980 to 1984, 1/3 of all Catholic priests that were ordained reported having a homosexual orientation, if you can believe it.
What was that? Say that one more time.
Yeah. From in the early 1980s, 1 out of 3 Catholic priests who were ordained reported in 2002 that they had a homosexual attraction.
That's astounding.
Yeah.
Which means that they were formed in 1970s era seminaries under Paul VI, not John Paul II.
Well, that's correct.
That might be too distant a causal factor, but maybe not.
Well, it isn't that number just came about overnight. the percent of homosexual ordinands had been rising since the 1960s. So by the end of the 1960s, you had about 12 or 15% of ordinands that were homosexual, and then it kept rising, and it peaked in the 1980s. Okay. But what that means is you started to have homosexual men in the Catholic priesthood beginning in the 1960s. And you don't need all of the Catholic priests to be homosexual to have a large group of men who are primarily attracted to boys or to men. And so the trend started way before the 1980s. It peaked in the 1980s. But the other thing that happened, it happens is if you look at the current reports, as I did, instead of looking at the retrospective reports, you find that the peak of the abuse was also in the 1980s. See, if you look at these retrospective trends, it not only understates the rate of current abuse, but it also, what we call, right truncates the distribution, which makes it look like the average or the peak of the distribution is earlier in time than it really is. And so when I corrected for that, I moved forward that average to the 1980s. There's other data and other information now that confirms that it was during the 1980s really that we had the height of those incidents of abuse.
Yeah.
And so there was I overlaid those two trends. By the way, I should mention, if your viewers are interested, they can go and download and read this report. It's available for free at several places on the internet. The best place to get it would be from the Ruth Institute website, which is ruthinstitute.org. But you can just Google the name of it and it'll come up.
Yeah,
and they can look.
I'm going to put it on my. It'll put a link at patrickcoffin.media too. Yeah.
Okay, great. And so they can look at the charts about what I'm talking about. But if you look at Figure 9, I overlay these two trends in a chart. And when I did the analysis, the correlation between those two trends, that is the percent of homosexual priests and the incidence of sex abuse, is a 0.90 correlation. It's a very, very strong correlation. And then if you correlate it with the percent of victims who were male, it's 0.98. It's an almost perfect correlation between the proportion of priests we have in the Catholic Church that are homosexual and the proportion of child sex abuse that involves male victims.
So when the one rises, the other rises.
That's correct. And so the idea that it's somehow not related to homosexual priests is just factually and empirically false.
Let me hit rewind a little bit. I have two questions for you. Question number one relates to the Kinsey format of the questioning, all right, used by the LA Times. Cast aside the deep problems with Kinsey and his methodology and his books and his deceptions. The way those questions are phrased. Now, tell me if I'm overplaying the card here.
Sure.
I'm putting myself in the shoes of the respondent, and I'm a closeted gay priest or whatever. I know what the church teaches about this. It would be like asking a high schooler about masturbation or a college kid about fornication. Do you often? How many times a week? And there's a built-in bias against telling the truth about yourself, since you know you're living a double life. Therefore, does this make sense?
Yeah.
Therefore,
sure.
isn't the proportion even higher given that? Who's going to self-report honestly?
Right. I would say it's a conservative estimate.
Okay.
And it may not be accurate. I think there are some reasons to think it's more accurate than not, but it may not be accurate. But to the extent it's not, we have more, not fewer, homosexual men in the priesthood at any point in time. It's hard to imagine that a heterosexual man would say, well, I'm going to report myself to be homosexual because I don't want people to know that I'm heterosexual.
That's true. That would probably be around zero.
Yeah.
But I mean the ones that are homosexual, and I mean the hiders, the ones who really have double-bolted the closet.
Right. So the bias is only going to be in the direction of that we're going to have some hidden or closeted homosexual priests.
Yeah.
And I don't know how many that is. Now, usually on surveys, if someone is not going to report, they just skip the question. And so you look at the non-response on the question.
Obvious warning sign, obvious warning sign.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
And on this question, there was surprisingly low non-response. I'm not looking at the report. I can't remember exactly, but it was under 5% non-response, which is very low on any national survey. You mentioned fornication. In fact, the survey asked about that and about all other kinds of embarrassing sexual misconduct questions that you can imagine. Were they faithful to their vows of celibacy? Had they engaged in masturbation? Had they looked at pornography? It asked all kinds of questions. So, priests who are not willing to answer sensitive questions probably didn't respond to the survey. So it may not be the best and most accurate data that we have, but we know that the bias is going to be only in one direction.
Yeah.
And the bottom line is it's the only data we have on the sexual orientation of priests. And so it's a survey that we use out of necessity, and we try to correct as best we can. This same survey was the subject of a book by Dean Hoagie.
Yes.
It was featured in a book by Dean Hoagie at Catholic University. And then
do you remember what that book is called, so I can put a link to it?
Yep. It's called Evolving Visions of the Priesthood.
Okay.
And then it was also the major basis for a book by Andrew Greeley, the late celebrated sociologist and novelist, and that was called Priests: A Calling in Crisis in 2004. And so I'm not by far not the first one or the only one to have used this particular survey with all of its probable faults.
Well, it's I put that in the category of our bulging better than nothing file.
Yes.
Right. Okay, my second question has to do with the dynamics in which an institution underwrites an external auditor or someone to conduct a study. And does that dynamic, and I'm going to the John Jay report now, the fact that all this data from 1950 to 2002 came out and showed that 81% of the victims were teen boys or young teen boys, not children, not adult women. 81% is that victim profile. And yet the creators of the report denied the correlation that everyone can see is right there.
Right.
Is that attitude on the part of the creators of the John Jay report partly due to being paid by the sponsoring organization and knowing what that sponsoring organization has a vested interest in painting this as something other than what it is? Does that question make sense?
It does make sense. My answer is that I doubt that was the reason. The John Jay researchers, as far as I can tell, are honest, heads-up researchers. I don't think that they would bias their research in order to satisfy the funders. If
I can interrupt, that's a very important point. I didn't mean to suggest that they were fudging the numbers or manipulating. I just mean the official interpretation of it. I've never heard any. I would love to be wrong here. Please tell me if I am. I would love to see an example of a bishop saying, "Well, the John Jay report designers are obviously misreading the data here. If 81% of a given population of victims were black and the assaulters, the perps, were white, I would say that's a racist attack problem. If 81% were Jewish in a Gentile neighborhood, I would say that's an anti-Semitic problem. But yet when it's 81% are teen boys, nobody wants to say that it's a homosexual predator problem.
Right. I think that is a problem in the interpretation in the church. The John Jay report did soft pedal, to put it mildly, that particular allegation or conclusion. If you read the whole report, there is stronger evidence that it's related to homosexual men than makes it to the executive summary and the points that they summarize at the top of the report, which is what most people end up reading.
That's problematic, no?
Yeah, sure. But I think that the John Jay researchers are secular academics. The bishops for their own reasons, and probably good reasons, wanted to have an objective evaluation of this problem in the church. They didn't want to turn to some Catholic institution that could be accused of having a bias in favor of the bishops. And so I think the John Jay researchers did a very good job overall in their reports, but they're secular researchers. And if you're a secular academic today and you publish something that is critical of homosexual persons, you have pretty much put your entire career on the line.
I think you've just laid your hand on it right there.
Yeah. So I think they just couldn't acknowledge that. It might be that in their way of thinking, and I've seen this often in our secular academic culture, they just can't make the thought connections to come to that conclusion. But even if they did suspect that, I think that they wisely, and in politics, what's the word? It would be impolitic, at least, for them to have acknowledged that.
Well, phobia is entrenched in our culture, right?
Yes, that's right.
And I don't know if it was an interview, Father Paul, or not, but you said something like, faced with the option of being called a homophobe or a bigot and protecting young boys, you're gonna be on the side of the boys and prevent further victimhood. Everyone's afraid of being called a bad name. It's just like, guys, man up. The truth is that Ben Shapiro says that facts don't care about your feelings. I think that applies here.
That's true. And also, I am utterly convinced that we need to protect those victims above all things, because that's where Jesus is. That Jesus told us that when he is here, he's going to be with the poor and the defenseless, those who are being abused and offended. And he was very precise about what happens to those who offend the little ones, whose angels behold the face of the Father in heaven. I don't want to be on the wrong side of that. I want to. Some people say it's courageous, but I think it's just having the right kind of fear. And I don't want to stand before God one day and have him say, you could have done something about this. Why didn't you?
Something about a millstone and the sea. Right?
Yeah, exactly. Right.
You may not know. I know that Richard Sipe, the famous psychotherapist, former Benedictine priest, has done an informal study on this. Anecdotally, are you able to give a rough estimate of the proportion of homosexual bishops, either in the U.S. or around the world?
I have no idea. I do know from subsequent research past this the study that we're talking about here, that most of the homosexual men in the Catholic priesthood today are concentrated between the age of 65 and 85. In other words, we have a big bulge of homosexual men who are in their older years now. And that would mean that we have a disproportionate number of bishops and other church leaders, people in positions of authority, who are themselves homosexual. Half of all Catholic priests today are between the age of 65 and 85. Now think about that. We have an aging priesthood.
That's worth repeating. Half of all priests in the U.S.
Yes, in the United States
are between 65 and 85.
That's correct.
Man, if you're 19 and you're listening to this and you're a young man, ponder the future of the church. Ask our Lord Jesus Christ if maybe you're called to be a priest, because that's talk about a demographic winter. This is the first time I'm hearing this.
Well, it's called the priest shortage in some circles, but we have a declining number of men in the priesthood. We have 8,000 fewer priests today than we had 20 years ago. We have just under 37,000 Catholic priests. In 2000, we had just under 47,000. So,
man, I was going to say as a joke, the upside is there are far fewer Catholics because no one's, the bleed out of the church is 6-1 now. That's Irish dark humor. Don't encourage me.
No, I understand. So the good news is, I guess, that or the bad news might be that we have a fairly high proportion of homosexual priests in the Catholic Church. The good news is that most of them are in that bulge between 65 and 85. So of that 50% of priests that are in that age range, a quarter of them are homosexual. 1 in 4 is homosexual. And so below that age, it's much, much less. I don't know exactly how much less. I'm debating with people whether it's anywhere from 0 to 5 or 6% homosexual below that age. And so if you fast forward 20 years in the church, you have a church with far fewer homosexual priests than we have today. Very few of them are going to be in authority and positions of power, and will be bishops. So I don't know how many bishops today are homosexual, but I can confidently predict that in the next generation, there are going to be way fewer bishops are homosexual.
Let me ask a question that I know some listeners, and maybe you, will find outrageous or inappropriate since he was just canonized. I've read from more than one source, not all of them kooky conspiracy sources, that there was a common rumor in the 60s and 70s that Pope Paul VI was a closeted homosexual. In fact, he's the only pontiff on record to go into writings denying it. When I look at the cardinal placements that he made, the people he elevated, including Archbishop Jadot, who was the nuncio in the U.S., who gave us Rembert Weekland and Bernardine and that whole era, Cardinal Mahoney and so on. The person who's at the top sets the tone for everyone else in the hierarchy. Is this is this a bizarre conspiracy theory, or could there be something to it, or at least something that it would explain why the rate spiked in the 70s and 80s?
I have to tell you, I have no idea. I don't have much knowledge of what you're talking about, and I couldn't say. It's a really difficult charge to deny if you say, well, this person was a closet this or a secret that.
Yeah, that's true. You deny that you're a racist.
I have no idea.
Yeah, it's like trying to say you're not a racist.
I have no idea. I hear these speculations and wonderings about our leaders and our bishops, and I just don't know what to make of them. I'm not angry with anyone. I love the Holy Father. I'm inspired by Pope Francis and a lot of the things he does and says. When people say, well, what about this or what about that, or he may have done this, I want to give him the complete benefit of the doubt. And I haven't seen any incontrovertible evidence that he's done a lot of these terrible things that he may be suspected of doing. And I have seen lots of evidence that he's done very good things. I mean, it was Pope Francis who quickly removed Cardinal McCarrick from being the cardinal and took steps to contain him. And people say, well, that's only because it was in the news. I don't know whether it was or not, but he took assertive, strong action to correct that situation. He did the same thing in Chile. It took him a while to get on board, but once he was on board, he was awesome.
Well, he certainly acknowledged his grave error in the case of Chile, which is pretty outrageous. And I'm actually in the camp of the theory that the conclusion that he acted because the glare of the spotlight was so profound. Unless Archbishop Vigano is a really skilled liar. I wanted to ask you if you had read his letters and if the claims he makes about the situation in all of his letters and the replies to Cardinal Ouellet and so on, they seem to cohere with your findings about the existence of this homosexual subculture that protects itself and is kind of baked into the institution. Is that a fair summary?
Well, it is a fair summary. And in Italy, my study was featured in a couple of media reports and articles that connected that with Vigano's revelations because they came out at about the same time. I can only say that I just don't know. I have read, at least I read up through December. If there's anything since December, I haven't read it, that has come out from Cardinal Vigano. It doesn't seem entirely plausible to me, the things that he says. There's clearly sort of an axe to grind. And so I don't know. He could be completely veridical, and he could be imagining things and could be mistaken. So I really don't know. To me, I have to say, it seems unwise and inappropriate for an archbishop to make public accusations like he has. There are procedures and ways to express those objections that the church has laid out that I think it could be effective.
Well, I've covered this before. He does say at the outset that he's tried every avenue that he could.
Okay.
The canonical thing, and I think a lot of good has come. A lot of light has been cast. It's like when our attitude toward our enemies in the media, right? Without the Boston Globe, as much as I say, look, they're a bunch of anti-Catholic demons, the Spotlight crew did shed light in areas that Catholic insiders were afraid to shed. Right. So there's, Providence can work things out sometimes in surprising ways.
I think so.
Can I ask you a question about the claim that you hear fairly frequently that it's really about opportunity. It's the occasion because you've got an all-male clergy, and there's I guess availability.
Yeah.
More than the inclination to act out in that way. Yeah,
I think that's true. I think opportunity is definitely a factor. In the research that I did, I found that the overall correlation was 90%. 98% from male victims overall, but if I can find it only to children under the age of 8, it dropped by about 20%. Now, what that tells me, the children under the age of 8, it was mostly male victims. They were too young to be altar servers. These were children that there was no particular differential opportunity between males and females. And so you had a higher proportion of females who were abused. You still had mostly males. But what I take from that and what that might imply, and I say this in the study, is that opportunity might explain part of the rise in abuse. And if I parse out the numbers, I say that about 4/5 of the abuse of males seems to be attributable to homosexual priests or men, at least, who were attracted to males rather than females as sexual objects. But the other 5th very well might be due to differential opportunity. The boys were more available than girls were. So I don't think it's an either or. I think both of them could be true, and both of them are good points to look at. And we should certainly harden parishes and harden the institutions of Catholic life to reduce opportunity.
In the 1962 directive under Pope John the 23rd, there's a very clear, unambiguous regulation that homosexuals are not to be permitted into the seminary.
Right.
And that slowly got ignored, as the charter in 2002 was slowly ignored. You see this kind of human nature creeping back in. Did you read Michael Rose's Goodbye, Good Man, which I think came out in the 90s?
No, I'm sorry, I haven't read it.
Yeah, he maintains that when we say the phrase vocation crisis, what we really mean is good men, i.e. solid Orthodox, rosary-praying men, were filtered out gently by selection committees at the seminary level. And so Goodbye, Good Men indicates this the rejection pattern that led to their being excluded, and more kind of people that fall into the homosexual agenda did get ordained and were promoted. That's his thesis.
I think that's absolutely true. And he's not the only one that's made that point.
Sure.
Donald Cozzens, who is no conservative, made that point in his book on the seminaries. And you're going to ask me the name of his book. I don't remember.
What's the name of his book, Father Paul?
Yeah, I'm sorry.
I'll find it. I'll put in the link. No, it's good. I'll put it in there.
It's about priests, something about priests. And he talks about the rise of the homosexual subcultures in the seminary, and he points out that it was so bad in the 1980s that heterosexual men felt disoriented and like they didn't belong. That's his argument. Also, a book that came out by CARA on the priesthood.
That's the Center for something Research.
Center for Applied Research in the Apostolate.
Yes, that's Georgetown, right? That's excellent. Yeah.
And it's called Same Call, Different Men. But they point out that also that it looked like heterosexual men were dissuaded from persisting into the priesthood. So it wasn't just that homosexual men were ordained, but it is, I think from several sources, we have the idea that heterosexual men were also disinclined or dissuaded from entering into the priesthood.
I think I got the name. The Changing Face of the Priesthood by David
That
Cousins.
is it.
Yeah,
that's it.
We might also add W. Richard Sipe too, another non-conservative who's noticed this pattern as well. I'll also look up that CARA thing too.
That's an amazing memory. That's just great.
Well, it's. I would say I love the subject matter. In this case, I don't like the subject matter, but certain names do stick.
I can tell you can compute pi to one number short of infinity.
Boy, I have to think even what that means. Wow. I am not gung-ho in the Hope Department when I learned that the Holy Father had appointed Blaise Cardinal Supich to be part of the leadership team. This is the prelate from Chicago who said that gay predators and child rapists represented a rabbit hole the Pope wasn't going to go down because he had other things to think about, like my immigration patterns and the environment. The record there is kind of speaks for itself. Of course, the Holy Spirit is the Lord of the universe, so we're not without hope. But you coined a really great phrase, disoriented. There's a book title for you.
Yeah.
The experience of heterosexual seminarians who feel disillusioned and excluded from the culture.
Yeah, I think that's true. But what has happened since the 1980s is a sea change in the priesthood. We have a rise of a generation of very faithful, assertive, young Catholic men. It started with John Paul II, and they started populating seminaries in the 1980s with some problems, but they persisted, and today they, I think, dominate the men coming into the priesthood. It's really a new generation. If you look at them, if you study them and look at the data and the responses on them, this shows up in the same survey by the Los Angeles Times, where when they asked, the percent of priests who reported a homosexual attraction by age drops off dramatically as you get to younger age. And so in that survey, of the priests under 40, you had a very small proportion, I forget the exact proportion, under 10%, well under 10%, who were homosexual. And the priests under 30 in this LA Times survey in 2002, 0% were homosexual. So you had, I think, just the beginning of that population coming into the priesthood. And I think that they have started to take over the church, the priesthood, and are doing some good things. So it's not all bad news.
Well, amen. That's a good point. Maybe we can turn toward the close of our conversation, Father Paul. When I look at footage of John Paul II, when he thundered the word silencio against the Marxists and the communists who were peppered throughout the audience, and he had the most masculine. This sounds strange. He had the most masculine hands. Look at the photos of him holding up the chalice. He was like a Polish, salt mine worker guy, a very masculine bearing to him, just a manly, athletic. And that's, we're mimetic by definition. Young men want a high adventure that's hard. They don't want the jacuzzi hammock lifestyle, and John Paul II modeled that.
Yes, he did. Well, he worked in a rock quarry, didn't he, during the war? And I think that he was calling families to faithfulness, and he was always calling men to devote themselves to their family or to devote themselves to their Lord in place of family. It is a virile, heterosexual, masculine thing to do. And that vision of celibacy is very much being recovered today by our younger priests and being put in place in a strong way in our church.
Last question, since you've got a unique vantage point as being a PhD holder, researcher, sociologist, author, and you're also a Catholic priest who is married. What do you say to the objection that goes like this? if the church would just allow men to marry, the pedophile problem would go away?
There are far more pedophiles in families than there are in the Catholic priesthood. We have to recognize that the number one predictor of sex abuse in our society is a child who has a stepfather who's not living with their own natural father. And the number two predictor is just the father of a child. Fathers of children have greater access to their children than anyone else in society. So if opportunity is a factor, they have the best opportunity. So in my research on married Catholic priests, I report in my book that the rate of child sex abuse by married Catholic priests is exactly the same as it is in the priesthood overall. The difference is that for married Catholic priests, it's fathers who are abusing their own children, and those children tend to be more girls than boys. And that's the way it is with child sex abuse in our society generally.
If you had one word to summarize your assessment, opinion, view, appreciation of your own priesthood, what would it be like?
Boy, that's a question. I guess the one word would be gratefulness. I am extremely grateful to God for the gift of priesthood and the gift of marriage. It is a wonderful, wonderful blessing in my life. You know, as a convert, I'm really glad to be on the ship. I'm so glad that I've been accepted and come home to this church. And there was no necessity or guarantee that I would be a priest, that I could be ordained as a priest in the Catholic Church. But in a way, I didn't really care. I was on the ship. I didn't really care what I did on the ship. You can put me down the bottom, have me
swab the decks.
Shovel the bilge. I don't care. As long as I'm on the ship, I'm happy for that. So it's been a great grace to go beyond that and to experience the grace of God. Let me tell you something that's just thrilling to me. A few years ago, I had to go in the hospital for an operation. It was not. It was a serious operation I was going to be put under, and so we called the local parish, and the priest came out. And I was thinking he was going to give me anointing for healing, but he gave me the entire last rites. So I made my confession, and then he gave me a viaticum, and I realized about a half hour after he had done that I had become, at that moment, one of the very few people in all of human history to have received all 7 sacraments of the Catholic Church. And there was a feeling of grace and blessing and benefit from that has not gone away. It just, I think of it almost every day. Out of all the people on earth, God would bless me in this way to do that. And that might not mean anything to many other people, but to me, it's just amazing.
You should write that out. That is I can see that being a blog post that would go viral. So my lips to God's ears. Seriously, that's a very interesting. You're a sliver of 1% of all the Christians who ever walk the earth. Yeah, I know. Beautiful. So, thank you. Well, Father Sullins, thanks for all your work. Thanks for your time today, and above all, thank you for your priesthood. And do keep in touch. I know this episode is going to go viral, and I hope it gets what it deserves, people listening and learning all over the world. I do want to mention the website to the Ruth Institute, ruthinstitute.org. I'm going to put all the links to all the resources that we mentioned today at patrickcoffin.media. This is a listener-supported show. If you're listening on YouTube, subscribe so you don't miss an episode. They come out early Tuesday morning. And CoffinNation.com has members in 5 countries, and we're growing all the time. It's for culture builders. So iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, everywhere else. Father Paul, thanks a lot. God bless. Thanks for your priesthood once again.
Thank you, Patrick. It was a great joy to be with you today.
This is the Patrick Coffin Show. Be a saint. What else is there?
Hey, this is Patrick Coffin. If you like what you see and hear, and you want to see and hear more, consider joining Coffin Nation as a full member. Just click right here and find out more about what that means. Nipsey, my fedora. That's Coffin Nation, the world's largest online community of culture builders. Click right here. See you on the inside.